Good afternoon. So, I'm a sociologist. And sometimes when I tell people that, they say, oh, you help people. You help people who need a lot of counseling. And I, slightly taken aback, wondering if they're thinking I'm a social worker or perhaps a clinical psychologist, I answer meekly, no, that's not quite what I do. I'm a researcher, and I think about how society operates. And I do that by thinking about how different groups of people relate to each other. Specifically, I study how we all contribute to the problems of social inequality in our society through the choices and behaviors that we engage in, through our schools, in our communities, through the choices that we make with our friends, in our partner selections, through the behaviors that we engage in as we compete with one another, trying to make it to the top, often unconscious and unwittingly engaging in behaviors that sometimes may adversely affect the welfare of others. So several years ago, I decided to go back to high school after many years. Now, that's not something I'll do again. And I visited 8 high schools in 2 countries, this country and South Africa. All of these schools were relatively high-performing schools. Half of them were schools attended by students predominantly of color. Half of them were white-dominant schools. And I remember on a particular day, I was going into a school and it was all abuzz because the students were about to attend an assembly. It was an assembly about a new program being introduced to this school, and it was on social differences. Well, afterwards, I was given the opportunity to debrief with a group of kids. And as we sat and we dialogued and they shared their opinions, some of them even cried as they shared their stories, I noticed that a young boy turned to another, an African-American male, and he said, and I quote, "Oh, she's so smart, and she looks just like us." Now, for some that may have sounded like a compliment, but for me that was sobering, and I was disturbed. Because you see, this kid was attending an ethnically diverse and very affluent high school where he had never seen any models of African American intelligence among his teachers. That was sobering to me because I grew up in the Mississippi Delta in the 1970s and 80s, where I had teachers who empowered my classmates and me to believe that we could do absolutely anything we wanted to do, provided that we worked hard enough. Mind you, the forces of segregation made it hard for us to actually have the kinds of resources that kids across town had. But they believed in us and they empowered and instilled in us the idea that we could achieve. So fast forward over 25 years later, and I'm in one of the country's best high schools, where there are groups of kids getting signals and signs about what was possible and not possible. So when I visited this school and several others like it, I noticed several things. I noticed, for example, that I, nervously, had to make decisions about where to sit when I visited the school cafeteria. Sometimes that happened in the teachers' lounges. Because you see, kids were actually dividing themselves according to different social lines. I noticed that when I entered the upper echelon of courses in these high schools, the courses that presumably were preparing kids for the rigors of college and university, I saw very few kids who looked like me, African American or Latino. I also noticed in some of these schools that baseball and cheerleading were to white boys and white girls, respectively, while basketball and step dancing were to black boys and black girls, respectively. This was curious to me. We're often uncomfortable moving across our social and cultural comfort zones, aren't we? And so what I chose to do as a sociologist, putting my hat on, is I wanted to understand what were the factors in a school context that would facilitate the ability for kids to cross academic, social, and cultural boundaries. And so I developed a survey. And on this survey, I asked kids about their friendship preferences. I asked them, how much of a difference would it make for you to have a friend who was of a different race or ethnicity, religion, gender, who had different cultural and social tastes from you? And here's what I found. I found a number of things first. One of them was that context matters. And context mattered in different ways. First of all, those kids who were engaged in some of the most rigorous and hands-on courses reported higher levels of what I call cultural flexibility from this scale. I also noticed that the kids, particularly among white students, those living in the northern states, reported higher cultural flexibility than those who were living in the southern states. Being a Southerner, I kind of got that. The boundaries are rigid in the South. But here's the one I want to focus on the most. I recognize that among African American students, those who were attending the majority minority schools that were not as affluent reported higher levels of cultural flexibility than the kids in the school that were presumed to be more diverse and more affluent. And that posed a conundrum for me. Seriously, a paradox, if you will. Because you see, we social scientists have found that academic resources, strong school contexts matter to the overall educational outcomes of kids. But it is true that many students come from very disparate contexts when it comes to their family backgrounds. Yet at the same time, if we want them to move up the proverbial ladders to college and university, they need the resources invested. You see, I know this. When I was 16 years old, a high school history teacher, a white woman, gave me a blue book. And that blue book was information about a summer program at an elite boarding school on the East Coast. That book, that moment, changed my life's trajectory forever. I wouldn't be standing here without it. That book introduced me to Phillips Andover Academy, where I had two pivotal moments. One, I got my first royal academic butt kicking. And second, I met my besties that summer who introduced me to a place that I thought was named after a color. They were going to take a college visit to this university in New England, and they said, "Prudence, you have to come. This place is great." And I was like, oh, okay, I'd never heard of it. The tickets were sold out by the time I got there. There's this university called Brown. Have you heard of it? At any rate, that fall, when I was getting ready to apply to university, and I didn't know very much about how to apply to selective colleges and universities, I got a catalog in the mail, and I decided on the whim to apply to Brown. And I got in. I had done well in high school, very well, actually. My test scores were good. But what was more important about that is that that teacher who gave me that book created an opportunity and became, like Professor Hawksby talked about this morning, an informational resource for a student who was coming out of a disparate context. She became social capital. And my besties did too by introducing me to this place called Brown because I didn't have the cultural capital, the know-how about this place. So this is how I know that these really great opportunities matter. But here's what I found out in my research. While resource-rich educational opportunities and contexts are absolutely necessary, they're not sufficient when it comes to many groups of kids who need to be incorporated. I found in my research that we also have to concentrate on the social and cultural environment of the school if we want to understand more effectively how to move kids from the margins to the center of education. So you see, here's the second part of that conundrum, that paradox, is that African American students who were attending schools and came from backgrounds just like the kids who were attending the more affluent schools were actually doing better and reported higher levels of cultural flexibility, were more deeply engaged because in their schools they were enrolled in the higher echelon courses, the advanced courses. They were going to Model UN. They were participating in debate club. They were traveling with the chorus and the band. They weren't segregated. And that explained a lot of what I was seeing. And so this study actually showed to me that diversity is not enough to get to integration. Diversity is about demographic change. Integration is about cultural and organizational change. One of the students, I'll call him Judah, who attended one of these affluent high schools, his mother and his father wanted him to have an excellent education, just like many parents do. But Judah and his peers suffered. There was a strong academic gap in their high school. And he said to one of my research assistants, if we want to reduce the academic gap, then we have to also eradicate the empathy gap. That's a very incisive comment for a 15-year-old. And what Judah was referring our attention to through our interviews and our observations was how these kids didn't feel like they necessarily belonged. When something would become missing in the school, oftentimes the kids from the inner city were presumed to have taken it. There were lower expectations about them. Many of them weren't encouraged to have the higher aspirations like I did, to go on to better and more rigorous places. And so Judah and his colleagues, while they were in rich, resource-rich schools, were not necessarily aspiring and reaching as far as many of their peers and classmates. So from all of this research, I tend to ask myself and I tend to ask educators, when you're teaching kids from different backgrounds, do you consider how you create communities of difference that bring all students toward the center? How aware are you about the limitations of your own cultural knowledges and what's there and what's not there? I also ask, how aware are we symbolically about how we create lines within our schools separating the us from the them? These are the kinds of things that we as researchers know. In fact, social psychologists, my colleagues here at Stanford, Jeff Cohen and Greg Walton, have found that the more students feel that they belong in an educational context, the better they perform. Which is why I found in some schools that kids who were just like the ones I was studying in the more diverse and affluent schools were really doing much better, despite the fact that they didn't have the stratospheric test scores. So I know that we can do better. I know that history tells us and informs us that we can make progress through our educational institutions. And what I have come to conclude from my research is that we can all shift the tides of social and educational inequality if we provide ample resources and opportunities, if we cultivate culturally flexible minds, and if, as that wise 15-year-old said, we come with empathic hearts. Thank you.